The fever had started 3 days ago, but Logan Quincy hadn't stopped working for a single hour because the cattle wouldn't feed themselves, and the fences wouldn't mend on their own. And if he didn't keep the ranch running then, everything his father had built would crumble into dust, just like his old man's bones had 6 months prior. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand as he hammered another post into the hard Colorado ground, his vision swimming in the August heat of 1882. Though he knew deep down that the sun beating down on Aurora wasn't entirely to blame for the way his whole body felt like it was burning from the inside out. Elena Norwood had been watching him from the kitchen window of the main house for the past hour, her hands twisting the dish towel into knots, as she observed the man she'd been working for these last 4 months stumble and catch himself against the fence post. She'd come to the Quincy ranch as a housekeeper after her father's mercantile business had gone under, leaving her family with nothing but debts and broken dreams. Her mother had taken her younger siblings back east to live with relatives, but Elena, at 22 years old, had insisted on staying in Colorado to send money back to help them rebuild their lives. She'd expected to cook and clean for a gruff rancher, maybe face some unwanted advances she'd have to firmly rebuff. But instead, she'd found Logan Quincy to be nothing like the rough men she'd encountered in town. He was 26, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that fell across his forehead when he forgot to cut it, and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm rolled in over the mountains. More importantly, he was kind in a quiet, steady way that made her heart do strange things she hadn't expected when she'd taken this position. He always thanked her for meals, asked about her family in his letters, and paid her fairly without a single inappropriate word or glance. Over the months, their conversations had grown longer, stretching from polite exchanges about the weather to real discussions about books they'd read, dreams they'd had, fears they carried in the dark hours of the night when sleep wouldn't come. But now he was sick, that much was obvious, and he was going to work himself into an early grave if someone didn't stop him. Elena set down the dish towel with firm resolution, untied her apron, and marched out into the yard with her dark hair coming loose from its pins in the dry wind. She'd been raised to be proper and demure, to let men make decisions and keep her opinions to herself, but watching Logan collapse would violate something deeper than social propriety, something that had taken root in her chest without her permission. "Mr. Quincy," she called out as she approached, her boots kicking up dust with each determined step. He turned at the sound of her voice, and she could see the glazed look in his eyes, the unhealthy flush across his cheekbones that had nothing to do with exertion. "Miss Norwood." "Something wrong with the house. The house is fine. You are not fine." She planted herself directly in front of him, close enough to see the tremor in his hands, the way he was swaying slightly on his feet. "You have a fever. You need to be in bed, not out here destroying yourself in this heat." "Cattle need tending," he said, his voice rough and strained. "Fences down on the eastern pasture. If I don't fix it, they'll wander onto Henderson's property and he'll claim them as his own. You know how he is." "I know how you are," Elena shot back, surprised by the force of her own words. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as bullheaded. Your father built this ranch over 20 years. It will survive one day without you working yourself to death." Something flickered in Logan's expression, something raw and painful. "My father built this ranch and then died and left me to keep it running. I'm all that stands between this place and ruin. I can't just stop because I feel a little under the weather." "A little under the weather." Elena reached out before she could stop herself, pressing the back of her hand against his forehead. His skin was burning hot, and he closed his eyes at her touch like a man dying of thirst who just found water. "Logan, you're burning up. This isn't a slight cold. This is serious." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both noticed it at the same moment. His eyes opened, meeting hers, and something passed between them that made the air feel charged like it did before lightning struck. "I have to keep working," he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now, and when he took a step forward he stumbled badly enough that Elena had to grab his arm to keep him upright. "No," she said firmly. "You don't. You're going to go inside, you're going to get into bed, and you're going to rest. I'll handle the ranch." He actually laughed at that, a short, bitter sound. "You, Elena, no offense, but you're a housekeeper. You've never worked cattle in your life. You can't just watch me." She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin in defiance of his doubt. "I grew up helping my father in the mercantile. I know how to work hard, how to figure things out, how to do what needs doing. I'm not some delicate flower who'll wilt at the first sign of difficulty." "The ranch isn't a store," Logan protested, but he was leaning on her now, his weight heavy against her side, and she could feel the heat of him through both their clothes. "It's dangerous work. The cattle are unpredictable, and Henderson's been looking for any excuse to cause trouble. If something happened to you, nothing will happen to me." Elena began steering him toward the house, taking slow, careful steps as he struggled to keep his feet under him. "I'm more capable than you think. And right now, the most dangerous thing happening on this ranch is you trying to work through a fever that's clearly getting worse by the hour." They made it up the porch steps through sheer determination on Elena's part, Logan barely able to lift his feet high enough to clear each riser. Inside the house, the air was marginally cooler, and she guided him through the parlor and down the hallway to his bedroom, a space she'd cleaned many times but never entered while he occupied it. "This isn't proper," Logan mumbled as she pushed open the door. "You shouldn't be in my bedroom." "Propriety can go hang," Elena said bluntly, maneuvering him to the bed and letting him collapse onto the quilt his mother had made years before her own death. "Right now, you need help, and I'm the only one here to give it." She pulled off his boots while he lay there looking up at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. His work shirt was soaked through with sweat, and she knew she should probably help him out of it, but that felt like crossing a line she wasn't quite ready to cross, fever or no fever. "I'll get you some water and cool cloths," she said, stepping back from the bed. "You're going to drink as much as you can and try to bring this fever down. I'll check on you regularly, but in the meantime, I have work to do." "Elena." His hand shot out, catching her wrist with surprising strength for a man who could barely stand. His eyes were fever bright but focused on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You don't have to do this. I can hire someone from town, one of the day laborers. You shouldn't have to work the ranch." "I want to," she said softly, and realized with a start that it was true. Not just because he needed help, but because this place had become home in a way she hadn't expected, and Logan had become something more than an employer, though she'd been too afraid to examine exactly what he'd become. "Let me help you, please." His grip on her wrist loosened, his hand sliding down to briefly clasp hers before falling back to the bed. "You're remarkable," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "You know that." Heat that had nothing to do with the August temperature flooded her cheeks, and she pulled her hand back, flustered. "Rest now. I'll be back soon." She fled the room before he could say anything else, her heart hammering in her chest like a wild thing trying to escape. In the kitchen, she pumped water from the well, filled a pitcher and a basin, grabbed clean cloths from the linen cupboard, and carried everything back to his room. Logan's eyes were closed when she entered, but she could tell from his breathing that he wasn't asleep, just exhausted beyond measure. Elena set the basin on the nightstand, soaked a cloth in the cool water, wrung it out, and gently laid it across his forehead. His eyes opened at the touch, finding her face. "Thank you," he whispered. "Drink some water," she instructed, helping him sit up enough to get the cup to his lips. He drank deeply, desperately, and she refilled it twice more before he waved it away. "The cattle," he started, but she cut him off. "I'll handle it. Where do you keep your father's work logs? I assume he kept records of what needed doing and when." Logan blinked at her in surprise. "In the desk in the office. The brown leather journal. But Elena, you can't." "Yes, I can. Now rest." She adjusted the cloth on his forehead, allowing herself one brief moment to smooth back his sweat-dampened hair before turning toward the door. "I'll come check on you in a few hours." In the office, she found the journal exactly where Logan had indicated, along with neat columns of numbers showing feed costs, cattle sales, and ranch expenses going back years. His father had been meticulous, and Logan had continued the tradition. She flipped to the most recent entries, scanning Logan's angular handwriting to see what tasks he'd been tracking. Eastern fence repair, cattle feeding, water trough maintenance in the north pasture, check on the pregnant cows in the south field. Move the herd away from the creek before the water got too low. It was a daunting list, but Elena had never been one to back down from a challenge. She changed out of her house dress into an old split riding skirt she'd bought at the general store but never had occasion to wear, put on her most practical boots, and grabbed one of Logan's work hats from the peg by the door. It was too large for her, but it would keep the sun off her face. The first task was the fence. She found Logan's tools where he'd dropped them, picked up the hammer and the bag of nails, and examined the section he'd been working on. The posts were set but not entirely secure, and several rails still needed to be attached. She'd never built a fence before, but she understood the basic principle well enough. Nail the rails to the posts, make sure they were level and strong enough to contain several 100 pounds of cattle. How hard could it be? 3 hours later, with blisters forming on her palms and her arms aching from swinging the hammer, Elena had to admit it was significantly harder than she'd anticipated. But the fence was repaired, sturdy enough that she could lean her full weight against it without anything budging. Pride swelled in her chest as she gathered the tools and headed back to the barn to put them away. The cattle were her next concern. She'd watched Logan feed them often enough from the kitchen window, seen him haul hay and scatter it in the feeding areas, check their water supply. She could do that. She would do that. The hay was heavy, each bale weighing more than she'd expected, but she dragged them one by one to the feeding stations, used a pitchfork to break them apart, and spread them out the way she'd seen Logan do. The cattle watched her with their large, placid eyes, clearly unimpressed by this new human attempting to care for them, but they ate the hay readily enough once she'd distributed it. Water was easier. The troughs were low but not empty, and she hauled buckets from the well until each one was full to the brim, her shoulders screaming in protest by the time she finished. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and Elena realized with a start that she'd been working for nearly 6 hours without stopping. She needed to check on Logan. Inside the house, she washed her hands and face in the kitchen basin, wincing at the raw patches on her palms, then filled a new pitcher with fresh water and carried it to Logan's room. He was asleep this time, genuinely asleep, but the flush on his face seemed worse than before, and when she replaced the cloth on his forehead, his skin was still burning hot. Fear clutched at her heart. What if this wasn't just a passing fever? What if he had something serious, something that required a doctor? The nearest physician was in Aurora proper, a 2-hour ride from the ranch, and she couldn't leave Logan alone in this condition. But she also couldn't just do nothing. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, placed her hand gently on Logan's cheek, and made a decision. If the fever didn't break by morning, she'd ride into town and bring back the doctor, even if it meant leaving the ranch unattended for half a day. Logan's life was worth more than any amount of cattle or property. His eyes fluttered open at her touch, unfocused and glassy. "Father," he mumbled. "That you? It's Elena," she said softly, her heart breaking a little at the confusion in his voice. "Your father's gone, remember, but I'm here. I'm taking care of things. Elena." He said her name like a prayer, like she was something holy he'd been searching for. His hand came up, catching hers, holding it against his fevered cheek. "So cool. You feel so cool." "You have a fever," she explained, though she wasn't sure how much he was comprehending in his current state. "You need to drink more water. Can you do that for me?" She helped him sit up, held the cup to his lips, coaxed him to drink even when he tried to turn his head away. He managed half the pitcher before collapsing back against the pillows, his eyes already drifting closed again. "Did you fix the fence?" he asked, the words slurred with exhaustion and illness. "I did, and fed the cattle and filled all the water troughs. Everything's taken care of." A smile ghosted across his lips. "Knew you could do it. Remarkable, Elena." Then he was asleep again, his breathing deep and steady despite the fever, and she sat there for a long moment just watching him, her hand still clasped in his even in sleep. This man who'd worked himself sick rather than let his father's legacy fail. This man who'd treated her with nothing but respect and kindness, when so many others would have seen her as just another servant to order around. This man who'd somehow worked his way into her heart without either of them intending it. She carefully extracted her hand from his grip, pulled the light sheet up over his chest, and left the room to prepare something he could eat if he woke in the night. Soup would be best, something light and nourishing that wouldn't upset his stomach. She put beans on to soak and started chopping vegetables, her blistered hands making the work slower than usual. The house felt strange in the evening quiet, with Logan ill in his room instead of sitting at the kitchen table talking to her while she prepared dinner, as had become their habit. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the sound of his voice telling her about his day, asking about hers, sharing stories about his parents and the early days of the ranch. She told him things she'd never shared with anyone else, about how it felt to watch her father's business crumble, about the guilt of leaving her family, even though it was the practical choice, about the dreams she'd had as a girl that seemed foolish now in the harsh light of adult reality. He'd never made her feel foolish. He'd listened like her words mattered, like she mattered, and that had been a gift more precious than any wage. Elena finished the soup, left it to simmer on the stove, and went outside to do one final check of the ranch before nightfall. The cattle were settled, the barn was secure, and the repaired fence stood solid in the fading light. Everything was as it should be, and she felt a fierce satisfaction in that accomplishment. She checked on Logan twice more during the night, changing the cloths on his forehead, coaxing water into him when he was conscious enough to drink. And each time his fever seemed marginally less terrifying, though still present and concerning. By the time dawn broke over the mountains, she'd gotten perhaps 2 hours of restless sleep on the parlor sofa, unable to make herself retire to her own room on the second floor where she wouldn't hear if he called out. The morning brought fresh challenges. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, milked the cow, and fed the cattle again, her body protesting every movement after yesterday's exertions. But there was also a strange exhilaration in it, a sense of capability she'd never experienced working in her father's store or keeping house. This was different. This was building something, maintaining something, keeping a living enterprise running through sheer determination and will. She was hauling water to the northern trough when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Elena straightened, shading her eyes against the morning sun, and watched as 3 riders crested the hill separating the Quincy ranch from the neighboring Henderson property. The man in the lead was Charles Henderson himself, a thick-bodied rancher in his 50s with a reputation for expanding his holdings by any means necessary, legal or otherwise. The 2 men flanking him were clearly hired hands, rough-looking cowboys with guns on their hips and hostile expressions on their weathered faces. Elena's stomach tightened with apprehension, but she set down her water buckets and walked forward to meet them, refusing to show fear even as her heart raced. Henderson reined in his horse a few yards from where she stood, looking her up and down with an expression that made her skin crawl. "Well now," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "What do we have here? You must be Quincy's new housekeeper. Elena Norwood, isn't it?" "Miss Norwood," she corrected, keeping her voice level and firm. "What can I do for you, Mr. Henderson?" "I'm here to talk to Logan about his cattle that keep wandering onto my property." "Where is he?" "Mr. Quincy is unavailable at the moment. I'm managing the ranch in his absence." Henderson's laugh was ugly and his men joined in with matching grins. "You, managing the ranch, that's rich." "Look, honey, why don't you run along and get Logan so the men can talk business?" "I told you, he's unavailable." Elena crossed her arms over her chest, standing her ground despite every instinct screaming at her to back away from these men. "And I repaired the eastern fence yesterday, so there shouldn't be any more issues with cattle wandering onto your property. Was there anything else?" The false friendliness dropped from Henderson's face like a mask, revealing cold calculation beneath. "You repaired the fence." "A little slip of a woman like you," he glanced at his men. "Boys, maybe we should ride over and check that fence, make sure it's actually secure. Wouldn't want any accidents." It was a threat, barely veiled. Elena felt anger rise in her chest, hot and bright. "The fence is secure. You're welcome to inspect it from your side of the property line, but you have no business crossing onto Quincy land without permission." "Permission?" Henderson leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. "Listen here, girl. I've been patient with Logan while he plays at being a rancher, but his father's death changed things. This property borders mine, and I've got plans for expansion. You tell Logan that I'm prepared to make him a fair offer for his land, and he'd be smart to take it before circumstances make the offer less generous." "This ranch is not for sale," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly with the force of her anger now. "Mr. Quincy's father built this place from nothing, and Logan intends to honor that legacy. No amount of intimidation will change that." Henderson's expression darkened. "Intimidation? That's a strong word. I'm just being neighborly, pointing out realities. Running a ranch alone is hard work. Things can go wrong. Accidents happen. Cattle get sick, fires start, fences get cut in the night." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Would be a shame if something happened while Logan was unavailable and you were out here all alone trying to play rancher." One of Henderson's men snickered, and Elena felt ice run down her spine despite the warm morning air. But she'd faced down creditors who wanted to take everything her family owned, had stared into the face of poverty and loss, and she'd learned that showing fear only encouraged bullies. "I think you should leave now," she said, her voice cold and clear. "You've delivered your message, unwelcome as it is. Continuing to trespass on Quincy property would be unfortunate." "Trespass?" Henderson's face flushed red. "You threatening me, girl?" "I'm informing you of the law, Mr. Henderson. This is private property. You're not welcome here, and I'm asking you to leave. If you refuse, I'll have grounds to report your harassment to the sheriff in Aurora." For a moment, She thought Henderson might do something rash, might order his men to do something that would turn this confrontation into something far more dangerous. But then he seemed to think better of it, probably calculating that whatever reputation he'd built in the territory could be damaged by reports of threatening a woman alone on her employer's ranch. "Fine," he spat. "We'll leave. But you tell Logan that this conversation isn't over. Tell him Henderson always gets what he wants, one way or another." He yanked his horse's head around, spurring it into a gallop back toward his property, his men following close behind. Elena stood there until they disappeared over the hill, then let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking, she noticed distantly, and her legs felt weak. She just faced down one of the most powerful ranchers in the region with nothing but words and determination, and somehow she'd survived it. But Henderson's threats echoed in her mind as she returned to hauling water, feeding cattle, checking fences. Would he really try something? Cut fences in the night, harm the cattle, start fires. The thought was terrifying, but what could she do? She couldn't tell Logan about Henderson's visit, not while he was sick with fever. The worry would only make his condition worse. No, she'd have to handle this herself, just like everything else. The day passed in a blur of backbreaking work. Every muscle in Elena's body ached, her hands were covered in blisters, and she was fairly certain she'd never been so exhausted in her entire life. But she kept going, driven by something fierce and determined that had taken root in her chest. This was Logan's ranch, his father's legacy, and she would not let it fall apart on her watch. When evening finally came, she dragged herself back to the house, washed up, and went to check on her patient. Logan was awake this time, propped up slightly on his pillows, and though he still looked ill, the wild, glassy look had faded from his eyes. "Elena," he said, his voice rough but clearer than it had been. "What time is it?" "Nearly sunset. How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by the entire herd." He tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Did you really fix the fence and feed the cattle?" "I did. And hauled water and collected eggs and milked the cow, and a dozen other things I'm sure I'm forgetting." She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly too tired to maintain any pretense of propriety. "Your ranch is still standing, Logan Quincy. Though I have a new appreciation for why you look so exhausted every evening." He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between amazement and tenderness. "You did all that in one day. 2 days, technically. It's been 2 days since I forced you to rest." She reached out, checking his forehead with the back of her hand in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Your fever's better, not gone, but better. Because you took care of me." His hand came up, catching hers, and this time she didn't pull away. "Elena, I don't know how to thank you. What you've done, it's beyond anything I could have asked or expected. You don't need to thank me." She looked down at their joined hands, his skin warm but no longer burning, her fingers intertwined with his calloused ones. "I wanted to help. I wanted to prove that I could. You proved it." He pulled gently on her hand, drawing her closer, and she found herself leaning toward him without conscious thought. "You're incredible, strong and capable and brave, and I've been a fool. A fool how? For not telling you sooner how I feel about you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "I've been falling for you since the day you arrived, Elena Norwood. The way you hum while you cook. The way you leave books open on the kitchen table and forget about them until dinner. The way you're kind to the barn cats even though they're half feral and don't deserve it. The way you challenge me and make me think and refuse to let me wallow in grief over my father's death." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "The way you just took over an entire ranch without blinking because I was too stubborn to admit I needed help." Elena's heart was racing so fast she thought it might burst from her chest. "Logan, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted quickly. "I know I'm your employer and that makes this complicated. I know you might not feel the same way. But lying here for 2 days, drifting in and out of fever dreams, all I could think about was you. How much I wanted to tell you, how much I regretted keeping it to myself. If something had happened to me, if the fever had gotten worse, you would never have known." "I feel the same way," Elena said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I've been trying trying to keep things professional and proper, but I feel the same way. I think I have for a long time now." The smile that broke across Logan's face was like sunrise after a long night, bright and warm and full of promise. He tugged on her hand again, pulling her down until their faces were close enough that she could feel his breath on her lips. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have a fever," she pointed out, but she was already closing the distance between them. "Don't care," he murmured against her mouth, and then he was kissing her, gentle and sweet despite the roughness of his chapped lips, and Elena felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. She pulled back after a moment, breathless and flushed. "You should rest. You're still recovering." "I know." But he didn't let go of her hand. "Stay with me, just for a little while," so she stayed, sitting on the edge of his bed as the room darkened with the coming night, their hands clasped together, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. About the ranch and her family, about his plans for the future and her dreams that maybe didn't have to be abandoned after all. About what it might mean if they were something more than employer and employee, if they became partners in truth. "There's something I need to tell you," Elena said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Henderson came by today." Logan's expression immediately shifted from contentment to concern. "Charles Henderson. What did he want? To intimidate me, mostly. To tell you that he wants to buy your land and implied that bad things might happen if you refuse." She recounted the entire confrontation, watching Logan's jaw tighten with anger as she spoke. "That bastard," Logan growled when she finished. "He's been circling like a vulture since my father died, waiting for me to fail so he can swoop in and take everything. I should have warned you he might try something." "I handled it," Elena said firmly. "I told him the ranch wasn't for sale and that he needed to leave." "He went, but Logan, his threats sounded serious. What if he tries something? Then we'll deal with it." Logan squeezed her hand. "Together. You're not alone in this anymore, Elena. Once I'm back on my feet, we'll figure out how to handle Henderson and his schemes. You need to focus on getting better first. Everything else can wait." "Bossy," Logan said, but he was smiling. "When did you get so bossy?" "When I realized someone needed to make you see sense." She stood, gently extracting her hand from his grip. "Now sleep. I'll bring you some soup in a few hours, and you're going to eat every drop." "Yes, madam," he said with mock seriousness, but his eyes were warm as he watched her leave the room. Over the next 3 days, Elena fell into a rhythm. She woke before dawn to start the ranch work, feeding and watering the cattle, checking fences, doing all the countless small tasks that kept the place running. Then she'd return to the house, check on Logan, bring him food and fresh water, change his bedding and make sure his fever continued to improve. Then back out to finish the afternoon chores before starting the cycle again. It was exhausting work that left her collapsing into bed each night too tired to even dream, but there was satisfaction in it too. Every morning she woke to see the ranch still standing, still functioning, still thriving under her care. Every evening she sat with Logan and watched him grow stronger, the fever finally breaking on the 3rd day to leave him weak but clear-headed and on the road to recovery. And every conversation they had, every look they exchanged, Every casual touch as she helped him sit up or brought him meals deepened the connection between them until it felt like something solid and real, something that could be built upon. On the 5th day after Logan had fallen ill, he insisted on getting out of bed despite Elena's protests. "I've been lying around long enough," he said, swinging his legs over the side of the mattress with determination. "I need to see what you've done with my ranch." "Our ranch," Elena corrected without thinking, then froze as she realized what she'd said. Logan stared at her for a moment, then smiled so wide it transformed his entire face. "Our ranch. I like the sound of that." He was still weak. She could see it in the way he moved carefully, in how he had to lean on her as they walked outside into the bright afternoon sunshine. But his eyes were clear as he surveyed the property, taking in the repaired fences, the well-fed cattle, the tidy barn and full water troughs. "Elena," he said softly, "you did all this. I told you I would." "I know, but seeing it." He shook his head in wonder. "You didn't just maintain things, you improved them. That fence is better than I could have done. The cattle look healthier than they have in weeks. Even the barn looks more organized." "I may have rearranged some things," she admitted. "I hope you don't mind. It just seemed more efficient to keep the tools grouped by function rather than size." Logan laughed, and it was such a joyful sound that it made Elena's heart soar. "I don't mind. I don't mind anything you've done. You saved this place, Elena. You saved me. You would have done the same for me." "I would," he agreed. "But that doesn't make what you did any less extraordinary." He turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I meant what I said the other night. I'm falling in love with you. Actually, I think I've already fallen. And I know this is fast. And I know we should probably take time to figure things out properly. But I also know that life is short and uncertain, and I don't want to waste any more time pretending you're just my housekeeper when you're so much more than that." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words, by the depth of feeling she could see in his face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want you to stay. Not as an employee, but as a partner. As my wife, if you'll have me. I know I don't have much to offer except a struggling ranch and a lot of hard work. But I can promise you'll never doubt that you're loved, that you're valued, that you're the most important thing in my world." It was possibly the worst proposal in history, delivered while they both stood dusty and exhausted in the ranch yard. Logan still recovering from a fever, and Elena covered in hay and cattle feed. But it was also perfect, honest and heartfelt, and real in a way that no fancy restaurant proposal or carefully rehearsed speech could ever be. "Yes," Elena said, the word coming out half laugh, half sob. "Yes, of course, yes." Logan pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her forget about propriety and proper behavior, made her forget about everything except the feel of his lips on hers, his hands in her hair, his heart beating against her chest in perfect rhythm with her own. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Logan rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably tell people. Your family, the town, make it official." "We should," Elena agreed. "But first, you need to finish recovering, and we need to figure out what to do about Henderson." As if summoned by his name, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. But this time it wasn't Henderson and his thugs. It was a single rider, moving fast, kicking up dust as he raced toward the ranch. Logan tensed beside her, his hand dropping instinctively to his hip where his gun would normally rest, except he'd been too sick to wear it for days. Elena felt her own anxiety spike as the rider drew closer, close enough for them to make out details. It was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, wearing a deputy's badge and an expression of urgent concern. He reined in his lathered horse a few feet from where they stood, nearly falling from the saddle in his haste. "Mr. Quincy," he gasped out, "thank God you're all right. We heard you were sick, and then Henderson started spreading rumors in town that you died, that the ranch was abandoned." Logan's expression darkened. "Did he now? And let me guess, he just happened to mention that he'd be willing to take the property off the hands of any grieving relatives." The deputy nodded. "Something like that. Sheriff Roberts sent me out to check on the situation, make sure everything was legitimate. Henderson's been pushing hard to have the property declared abandoned so he can claim it under territorial law. Well, as you can see, I'm very much alive and the ranch is far from abandoned." Logan gestured to Elena. "Thanks to Miss Norwood here, who kept everything running while I recovered. In fact, we're engaged to be married, so there will definitely be family maintaining this property for years to come." The deputy's eyes widened, flicking between them. "Engaged? Well, congratulations. That'll put a stop to Henderson's scheming for sure. He can't claim abandoned property when there's two owners working it." "Two owners," Elena repeated, liking the sound of it more each time she heard it. After the deputy left to report back to the sheriff, Elena and Logan stood in the yard watching the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and gold. "Henderson's not going to give up," Logan said quietly. "Men like him never do. He'll keep pushing, keep trying to find ways to take what he wants." "Then we'll keep pushing back," Elena replied, slipping her hand into his. "Together." "Together," Logan echoed, and kissed her again as the sun disappeared behind the peaks. The next weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Logan recovered his strength slowly but surely, and once he was well enough to work full days again, he and Elena fell into an easy partnership managing the ranch. She had a natural aptitude for it, he discovered, an ability to see problems and devise solutions that impressed him daily. The organizational changes she'd made to the barn and storage areas improved their efficiency dramatically. Her suggestions for rotating the cattle through different pastures based on grass growth patterns increased their weight gain noticeably. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Books mostly," Elena admitted. "Your father had quite a collection on ranching and animal husbandry in his office. I've been reading them at night." "Of course you have." Logan shook his head in amazement. "Is there anything you can't do?" "Lasso a running steer," she said promptly. "I've tried 3 times now and failed spectacularly each time, though in my defense, those animals are surprisingly fast." Logan laughed, pulling her closer against his side. "I'll teach you. We'll practice with the fence posts first, get your technique down before you try with actual cattle." They were sitting like that, comfortable and content in each other's presence, when they heard riders approaching. Multiple riders this time, coming from the direction of town rather than Henderson's property. Logan stood, helping Elena to her feet, his hand resting on his gun as they waited to see who was coming. But as the group drew closer, he relaxed. It was Sheriff Roberts himself, along with 2 deputies and, surprisingly, a well-dressed man in city clothes riding alongside them. "Evening, Logan," the sheriff called out as they approached. "Miss Norwood, hope we're not disturbing you." "Not at all, Sheriff. What brings you out here?" Roberts dismounted, gesturing for the others to do the same. "This here is Mr. Franklin Pierce, territorial judge from Denver. He's been investigating some complaints about property disputes in this area." The judge stepped forward, a stern-faced man in his 50s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Mr. Quincy, Miss Norwood, I've been reviewing records related to Charles Henderson and his various land acquisitions over the past 5 years. there seemed to be some significant irregularities. Logan and Elena exchanged glances. What kind of irregularities? The kind that involve pressuring property owners to sell under false pretenses, filing fraudulent claims of abandonment, and in at least 3 cases, deliberately sabotaging ranches to force sales. Fences cut, water sources poisoned, cattle deliberately spooked into stampedes. Mr. Henderson has been running quite the operation, and it's taken us until now to gather enough evidence to bring charges. Elena felt her breath catch. He was going to do that to us. He came here and threatened that accidents might happen. Did he now? The judge pulled out a notebook. I'll need you to give me a full statement about that conversation, Miss Norwood. Every detail you can remember. It could be important to the case. Over the next hour, Elena recounted everything Henderson had said, every veiled threat and intimidating comment. The judge wrote it all down meticulously, asking clarifying questions, building a picture of Henderson's tactics. This matches the pattern we've seen with his other acquisitions, Judge Pierce said when she finished. He identifies struggling properties, increases their difficulties through sabotage, then swoops in with offers that seem generous compared to the deteriorating situation. By our count, he's illegally acquired at least 6 properties this way over the past 5 years. So what happens now? Logan asked. Now we arrest him and his associates on charges of fraud, theft, intimidation, and conspiracy. Your testimony, Miss Norwood, provides the final piece we needed. He made his threats to you before having a chance to carry them out, which proves intent and planning rather than just opportunity. The judge closed his notebook with satisfaction. Justice may be slow in coming out here, but it does come eventually. After the sheriff and judge left to execute their warrants, Logan and Elena stood on the porch in stunned silence. It's over, Elena finally said. The threat from Henderson, it's actually over. Thanks to you. Logan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. If you hadn't stood up to him, if you hadn't remembered exactly what he said, they might never have had enough evidence to stop him. I was terrified, she admitted. When he rode up with his men, I thought something terrible was going to happen. But you didn't back down. You didn't show that fear. You protected this ranch and me and yourself with nothing but your courage and your words. He turned her in his arms to face him. Have I mentioned lately that you're the most remarkable woman I've ever met? Once or twice, Elena said, smiling up at him. But I don't mind hearing it again. He kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise, and she melted into him, grateful for this man and this life and this second chance they'd both found in each other. 2 months later, on a crisp October morning with the aspen leaves turned to gold on the mountainsides, Elena Norwood became Elena Quincy in a simple ceremony in Aurora's small church. Her mother and siblings had made the journey from back east, tears of joy streaming down their faces as they watched her marry this quiet, kind rancher who looked at their daughter like she'd hung the moon and stars. Logan's friends and neighbors filled the pews, including several ranchers who had themselves been victims of Henderson's schemes and were grateful to see justice done. The atmosphere was festive, full of hope and celebration, and when Logan kissed his bride at the altar, the cheers could probably be heard clear to Denver. The reception was held at the ranch, which Elena had spent weeks preparing, transforming the barn into a beautiful venue with lanterns and wildflowers. There was food and music and dancing, and Elena had never felt so happy in her entire life as she did spinning in Logan's arms while their friends clapped along to the fiddle player's energetic reels. Happy, Logan murmured in her ear during a slower dance. Happier than I knew was possible, she replied honestly. This place, this life, it's everything I never knew I wanted. Good, because you're stuck with me now, Elena Quincy, no going back. I wouldn't dream of it. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart, offering congratulations and well wishes, Elena found herself standing in the yard watching the last wagon pull away, Logan's arm warm around her waist. "So, Mrs. Quincy," he said, "what do you want to do first? Now that we're married, I mean." Elena considered the question seriously. "I think we should expand the herd. With Henderson gone, his property is being divided up and sold. We could afford to buy some of his grazing land, increase our cattle operation significantly." Logan stared at her for a moment, then burst out laughing. "Only you would want to talk business on our wedding night." "Well, what did you want to do?" she asked, though the blush rising in her cheeks suggested she knew exactly what he had in mind. "I had some ideas," he admitted, pulling her closer. "But I love that your mind goes to the ranch first. We're going to build something incredible here, you and me. Something that will last for generations." "Generations," Elena repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "Yeah." Logan's hand drifted to rest gently on her stomach, his meaning clear even unspoken. "Yeah," she confirmed, covering his hand with hers. "But maybe we focus on getting through tonight first before we start planning the distant future." "Sounds like a plan to me," Logan agreed, and swept her up into his arms, carrying her into the house as she laughed and protested that she was perfectly capable of walking. "Thank you very much," though her arms wrapped around his neck and held on tight all the same. The years that followed were not without challenges, but Elena and Logan faced each one together. The first winter was hard, with snow piling higher than the fence posts and temperatures dropping so low that they had to bring the cattle in close to the barn to keep them from freezing. Elena worked alongside Logan every day, breaking ice on water troughs, hauling feed, tending to newborn calves who struggled in the brutal cold. When spring finally came, they emerged exhausted but triumphant, having lost only 3 head out of their entire herd, an impressive achievement for such a harsh season. That spring also brought other news, the kind that had Elena glowing with joy and Logan walking around in a daze of happiness and terror. "I'm pregnant," she told him one morning in April, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, Logan had just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he'd whooped loud enough to spook the horses, picked her up, spun her around twice before remembering her condition and setting her down very carefully, then proceeded to fuss over her for the rest of the day like she was made of glass. "I'm pregnant, not dying," Elena had finally said with exasperation when he tried to stop her from collecting eggs. "I can still work. Women have been doing both for thousands of years." "But those women weren't carrying my child," Logan had protested, though he'd backed off at the look she'd given him. They compromised. Elena continued to help run the ranch but agreed to avoid the most physically demanding tasks as her pregnancy progressed. Logan hired 2 ranch hands to help with the heavy work, young men from town who were eager to learn and grateful for steady employment. Elena spent more time managing the books, handling supply orders, and planning expansions. In December of 1883, on a snowy evening when the world seemed hushed and waiting, Elena gave birth to their first child with the help of the doctor from Aurora and Logan pacing anxiously in the hallway outside their bedroom. It was a long labor that left her exhausted and trembling, but when the baby's first cry split the air, all the pain was forgotten in the rush of overwhelming love. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, carrying the squalling, red-faced infant over to where Logan had burst through the door despite instructions to wait. "Healthy lungs on this one. Congratulations." Logan had tears streaming down his face as he looked at his son, this tiny person who was part him and part Elena and completely perfect. "Can I hold him?" "Let his mother hold him first," the doctor said with a smile, placing the baby in Elena's waiting arms. She looked down at her son, at his tiny fingers and scrunched-up face, and felt her heart expand to accommodate this new, fierce love. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world. What should we name him?" Logan asked, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, one hand resting gently on the baby's head. They'd discussed names, of course, had lists and preferences, but in that moment, Elena knew exactly what she wanted to call him. "Samuel, after your father. Samuel Logan Quincy." Logan's breath caught and fresh tears spilled over. "You do that. Name him after my father. Your father built this ranch from nothing, gave you something to build your life on, gave us this future. It's the least we can do to honor his memory." So Samuel he became. Little Sam, who grew into a boisterous, curious child who loved the ranch as much as his parents did. He took his first steps chasing after the barn cats, spoke his first word watching his father work with the horses, and by the time he was 3, insisted on helping with every ranch task, no matter how small his contribution actually was. 2 years after Sam's birth came a daughter, Lucy, who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn determination. And 3 years after that, another son, Michael, who was quieter than his siblings but just as loving. The ranch prospered under Logan and Elena's joint management. They'd purchased 2 sections of Henderson's former property after his conviction and imprisonment, expanding their grazing land and their herd. Elena's organizational skills and Logan's ranching knowledge combined to create an operation that became known throughout the territory for its quality cattle and ethical practices. They treated their ranch hands fairly, paying good wages and providing decent living conditions. They helped neighboring ranchers when trouble struck, sharing resources during hard times, and found that generosity repaid itself many times over in goodwill and assistance when they needed it. As the years passed, Aurora grew from a rough frontier town into a proper community with schools and churches and businesses. Colorado gained statehood in 1876, bringing with it more stability and law enforcement. The wild, dangerous days of the frontier gradually gave way to something more settled, though the land remained just as beautiful, just as challenging, just as rewarding for those willing to work it. Elena never regretted her choice to stay in Colorado, to take that job as a housekeeper that had transformed into so much more. Sometimes she thought about the path her life might have taken if she'd gone back east with her family, and she couldn't imagine being anything other than grateful that she'd stayed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Logan took her on a picnic to the eastern pasture, the place where she'd repaired that fence while he lay sick with fever, the place where everything had really begun. "You remember what you said to me?" Logan asked as they sat on a blanket watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "That first day when you insisted on taking over the ranch." "I said a lot of things that day," Elena replied with a smile. "You'll have to be more specific." "You said watch me when I doubted you could manage it. You looked at me like I'd insulted you by suggesting you weren't capable, and then you proceeded to prove me wrong in the most spectacular way possible." He took her hand, threading their fingers together in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "I think that's when I really fell in love with you. Not the only moment, but one of the big ones. You were so fierce, so determined, so absolutely certain of yourself." "I was terrified," Elena admitted. "I had no idea if I could actually do what I'd promised. I just knew I had to try. But you did it. You saved the ranch, saved me, saved us." Logan raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. Best decision I never made was getting too sick to work. Forced me to accept help, to see what was right in front of me all along. That's a terrible way to look at it, Elena protested, laughing. Please don't make a habit of working yourself into fevers just to prove a point. No promises. But Logan was grinning, that same smile that had made her heart flutter 10 years ago and still had the same effect now. Thank you, Elena, for everything. For staying, for fighting, for building this life with me. For Sam and Lucy and Michael, for being my partner in all things. Thank you for seeing me as more than just a housekeeper, Elena replied. For trusting me with your ranch, your heart, your future. For loving me the way you do. They sat there as the sun disappeared and the stars emerged, comfortable in the silence, comfortable with each other, comfortable with the life they'd built from illness and determination and love. The children grew, as children do. Sam developed into a natural rancher, absorbing everything his parents could teach him about cattle and land management with enthusiasm. Lucy proved to have her mother's head for numbers and strategy, often suggesting improvements to their operations that turned out to be remarkably effective. Michael loved the horses best, spending hours in the barn working with them, developing a gentle touch that had even the most skittish animals calming under his hands. By the time Sam turned 18 in 1901, the Quincy Ranch was one of the most successful operations in Colorado. They'd expanded their land holdings twice more, built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, and established a reputation that extended well beyond Aurora. Logan was 45 now, his dark hair threaded with silver, his face lined by years of sun and wind and hard work. But he was still strong, still active, still running the ranch alongside Elena with the same partnership they'd forged 20 years earlier. Elena, at 41, had aged gracefully, her beauty maturing into something deeper and more lasting than youthful prettiness. Her hands were work-roughened, her skin tanned from days spent outdoors, but her eyes still sparkled with the same intelligence and determination that had captivated Logan all those years ago. "You ever miss it?" Lucy asked her one afternoon as they worked together in the garden Elena had planted behind the house. "The life you left behind, the city, the easier work." Elena considered the question, her hands stilling in the dirt. "Sometimes I wonder what might have been," she admitted. "But I don't miss it, not really. This life, this place, your father and you children, this is where I was always meant to be. I just didn't know it until I got here." "How did you know father was the one?" Lucy pressed, her young face earnest and curious. She was 16 now, starting to notice boys in town, starting to think about her own future. "I knew because he made me want to be brave," Elena said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "Because he saw me as capable and strong even when I wasn't sure I saw myself that way. Because working with him felt natural, like we were two parts of the same whole. And because even when things were hard, even when we disagreed or struggled, I never doubted that he loved me, that he was on my side." "That sounds nice," Lucy said wistfully. "It is nice. It's also hard work." Elena resumed pulling weeds, her movements practiced and efficient. "Love isn't just a feeling, sweetheart. It's a choice you make every day, to be patient, to be kind, to put in the effort even when you're tired or frustrated or would rather be doing something else. Your father and I, we chose each other and we keep choosing each other day after day, year after year. That's what makes it last." Lucy absorbed this wisdom in silence for a moment. "I want that someday, what you and father have. You'll find it," Elena assured her. "Just don't settle for anything less than someone who sees you for who you really are and loves you for it." That evening, the whole family gathered around the dinner table, a nightly ritual that Elena insisted on despite their busy schedules. Sam talked about his plans to breed some of their best cattle, creating a line specifically suited to Colorado's harsh winters. Michael described the new foal that had been born that afternoon, his face animated with excitement. Lucy shared gossip from town, making everyone laugh with her dramatic retellings. Logan sat at the head of the table, watching his family with contentment written clearly across his features. His eyes met Elena's across the chaos of conversation and past dishes, and something warm and private passed between them, the kind of communication that needed no words after 20 years of marriage. After the children had cleared the table and retreated to their rooms to finish evening chores and homework, Logan and Elena sat on the porch in their customary rocking chairs, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Sam asked me today about taking over the ranch eventually," Logan said quietly. "Said he wants to know what we're planning for the future for succession. He's 18 now, old enough to start thinking about these things seriously." Elena reached over, taking Logan's hand. "What did you tell him?" "That the ranch is his if he wants it, but that he needs to understand it's not just inheriting property. It's inheriting responsibility, legacy, a way of life that demands everything you have to give." Logan squeezed her hand gently. "I told him about how my father built this place, how we nearly lost it when I got sick, how you saved it and me both. I wanted him to understand what this place really means, what it costs, and what it gives back." "What did he say?" "He said he understands. That he's been watching us his whole life, learning not just how to run a ranch but how to be partners, how to work together. He said he won't settle for anything less than what we have." Logan's voice held a note of pride. "We raised him right, Elena. Raised all of them right." "We raised them together," Elena corrected. "Just like we've done everything else together." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the familiar landscape fade into darkness. The ranch spread out before them, everything they'd built and fought for and protected over the years. The cattle in the distant pastures, the barn with its good horses, the fields where they grew hay and grain, the fences they'd repaired and replaced countless times. But more than the physical property, this place represented their love story, the life they'd created together from nothing more than illness and determination and faith in each other. Every building, every fence post, every animal carried memories of their partnership, their struggles, their triumphs. "You remember," Elena said softly, "that first night after you proposed, we stood right in this spot and watched Henderson's men ride away after the deputy came. You said we'd face whatever came together." "I remember," Logan confirmed. "One of the best moments of my life standing there with you, knowing you'd chosen me, chosen this life. We've had a lot of best moments since then. We have, and we'll have plenty more, God willing." Logan raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I love you, Elena Quincy, today, tomorrow, and every day after that until there are no more days left to count." "I love you too," Elena whispered, her throat tight with emotion. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." They sat there as the night deepened around them. Two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something lasting and beautiful from fever and faith, and the simple decision to work together rather than apart. The ranch stood solid and prosperous around them, proof that love and partnership could overcome any obstacle, could build something that would last for generations. And in the quiet Colorado night, with the stars bright overhead and the mountains standing eternal watch, Elena and Logan Quincy knew they'd made the right choices, followed the right path, found the life they were always meant to live. Years continued to pass in the steady rhythm of ranch life. Sam married a schoolteacher from Aurora named Margaret, a practical woman with a warm smile who fit into the Quincy family like she'd always belonged there. They had children of their own, 2 boys and a girl, who ran wild around the ranch the same way their father had done. Lucy surprised everyone by falling in love with a traveling veterinarian who passed through Aurora on his way to Montana. She married him against their initial concerns, but he proved to be a good man who loved her fiercely and supported her ambitions. They settled in Denver, where Lucy opened a business managing accounts for ranches and farms throughout the territory, using her natural head for numbers to help others the way she'd helped her family. Michael stayed close to home, never quite comfortable in town or around crowds, content to work with the horses he loved and live a quiet life. He never married, but he seemed perfectly happy sharing the main house with his parents and Sam's growing family, serving as the favorite uncle who always had time for games and stories. Logan and Elena grew older gracefully, their partnership deepening with each passing year. They gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Sam and Margaret, trusting them to carry on the legacy while still remaining active in advisory roles. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration that brought relatives and friends from across Colorado. The barn was decorated even more elaborately than it had been for their wedding, and this time 3 generations of Quincy's danced together under the lantern light. Elena, now 51, stood with Logan's arms around her watching their grandchildren play, and felt overwhelmingly grateful for the path her life had taken. The scared young woman who'd accepted a housekeeper position 30 years ago could never have imagined this future, this abundance of love and family and purpose. "What are you thinking?" Logan asked, his chin resting on top of her head in a gesture that had become habit over the decades. "I'm thinking about that day I made you go inside and rest," Elena said. "How terrified I was that I couldn't manage the ranch alone, but how determined I was to try. If I'd backed down, if I'd ridden to town for help instead of handling it myself, everything might have turned out differently." "But you didn't back down, you never do." Logan turned her in his arms to face him. "That's what I love about you, what I've always loved about you. Your courage, your strength, your absolute refusal to accept defeat." "I learned that from you," Elena protested. "You worked through sickness because you refused to let your father's dream die. You inspired me." "We inspired each other," Logan said firmly. "That's what partnership means. That's what love means. Building each other up, making each other stronger." Sam approached them then, carrying a glass of wine in each hand. "Mother, father, everyone wants to make a toast. Will you come?" They followed him to where the family had gathered, 3 generations of Quincy's and their extended relations and friends. Sam raised his glass and the crowd quieted, waiting. "30 years ago," Sam began, "my parents made a commitment to each other and to this ranch. They built something lasting, something strong, something that has provided for all of us and will continue to provide for generations to come. But more than that, they showed us what real partnership looks like, what real love looks like, working together, supporting each other, choosing each other every single day." He turned to Logan and Elena directly. "Thank you for building this family, this legacy, this example of what marriage should be. Thank you for showing us that love and work and determination can overcome any obstacle. Thank you for being exactly who you are." "Hear, hear," the crowd chorused, raising their glasses. Elena felt tears streaming down her face and Logan's hand tightened around hers. They raised their own glasses, accepting the toast, accepting the love and gratitude of their family. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the grandchildren had been tucked into various beds throughout the house, Logan and Elena walked out to the eastern pasture one more time. The fence she'd repaired 3 decades ago had been replaced several times since, but the spot still held significance for them, the place where everything had really begun. "We've had a good life," Logan said as they stood looking out over the land silvered by moonlight. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. The best life," Elena agreed, "full of love and family and purpose. No regrets, not a single one." She leaned into his side, fitting perfectly under his arm the way she always had. Just that I didn't marry you sooner." Logan pressed a kiss to her temple. "Should have proposed the first day you arrived, saved us both some time." Elena laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet night. "I would have thought you were insane and left immediately." "Probably," Logan admitted with a grin. "Good thing. I had the sense to wait until you'd already proven you could handle anything I threw at you." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, the same stars that had watched over them through 3 decades of marriage, through illness and threats, and hard work and triumph. The same stars that would continue watching over their children and grandchildren as they carried on the Quincy legacy. And in that moment, standing on the land they'd worked and loved and protected together, Elena and Logan Quincy were completely, perfectly content. The years that followed were quieter, gentler. Logan and Elena officially retired from active ranch management when Logan turned 60, though they both still puttered around, offering advice when asked and generally making themselves useful. Sam and Margaret ran the ranch with the same dedication and partnership his parents had modeled, and the operation continued to thrive. Elena started writing down family stories and ranch history, creating a record for future generations. She filled journal after journal with memories, lessons learned, wisdom accumulated over decades of living and working and loving. She wrote about the fever that had changed everything, about standing up to Henderson, about learning to rope cattle and birth calves and manage accounts. She wrote about Logan, about their children, about the life they'd built together. Logan spent his time working with his grandchildren, teaching them everything he knew about ranching and life and what really mattered. He was patient in a way he'd never quite managed when his own children were small, made wiser by age and experience. On a cool autumn evening in 1912, 30 years after that fateful fever, Logan and Elena sat on their porch wrapped in blankets against the chill. Logan had been moving slower lately, his joints stiff with arthritis, his breathing sometimes labored. But his mind was sharp, his love for Elena as strong as ever. "Tell me your favorite memory," Elena said suddenly, taking his hand under the blankets. Logan thought for a long moment. "The day you marched out to that fence and told me I was going inside whether I liked it or not. The look on your face, like you'd fight me if you had to. I was so sick I could barely stand, but I remember thinking that this woman, this incredible, fierce, beautiful woman was choosing to fight for me, for us, for something I'd almost given up on. That's my favorite memory. The moment I knew for certain that you loved me, even though we hadn't said the words yet." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "Mine is right after you proposed. Standing in the ranch yard, dusty and exhausted and completely inappropriate, and you were telling me I was the most important thing in your world. I'd never felt so valued, so seen, so loved. Everything else has just been building on that foundation." "We built something good," Logan said softly. "Didn't we? We built something amazing," Elena corrected, squeezing his hand. "A family, a legacy, a love that will outlast us both. That's better than good. That's extraordinary." Logan turned his head to look at her, his storm cloud eyes still as clear and loving as they'd been 30 years ago. "I'd do it all again. Every hard day, every challenge, every moment of doubt. I'd do it all again just to end up right here with you." "Me too," Elena whispered. "Every single moment." They sat there as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Two people who'd found each other through illness and determination, who'd built a life from nothing more than love and partnership, and the simple choice to work together rather than apart. Logan Quincy passed peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, at the age of 68, with Elena holding his hand, and their children gathered around his bed. His last words were, "I love you," directed at Elena with all the force and certainty he'd carried through their entire marriage. Elena mourned him deeply, but without regret. They'd had 44 years together, 44 years of partnership and love and shared purpose. She'd been blessed beyond measure, and she knew it. She lived another 5 years, spending her time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, finishing her journals, making sure the family stories were preserved and passed down. She died at the age of 76, on a spring morning with wildflowers blooming outside her window and Sam sitting beside her bed. "Tell me about when you first met Father," Sam asked, holding her frail hand gently. Elena smiled, her eyes distant with memory. "He was the most stubborn man I'd ever met, working through a terrible fever because he thought the ranch couldn't survive without him. I had to practically force him to rest, and then run the entire operation myself for days to prove I could do it." "That sounds like Father," Sam said with a sad smile. "It was the best thing that ever happened to us," Elena continued, her voice growing fainter. "That illness forced us both to see what we could be together, what we could build if we trusted each other. Everything good in my life came from that moment when I decided to be brave, to step up, to fight for something worth fighting for. You built something amazing, Mother. The ranch, the family, everything. You should be proud." "I am proud." Elena's eyes closed, then opened one more time. "Tell your children, Sam. Tell all of them. Love is worth fighting for. Partnership is worth working for. And sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when you choose to be brave, when you choose to help someone, when you choose to build something together rather than alone." "I will, Mother. I promise." Elena smiled one last time, squeezed his hand with what little strength remained, and slipped away peacefully, going to join the man she'd loved for over 4 decades. They buried her next to Logan on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a headstone that read, "Elena Norwood Quincy, 1860–1936. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and partner. She made him rest and ran the ranch herself, and in doing so built a legacy of love." The ranch continued for generations after them, passed down from parent to child, always managed with the same principles of partnership and hard work and respect that Logan and Elena had established. Their journals were preserved, their stories told and retold, their example held up as proof that love and determination could build something lasting. And on quiet evenings when the stars emerged over the Colorado mountains, descendants of Logan and Elena Quincy would sit on the porch of the house they built and remember the story of how it all began. With a fever, a fierce determination, and a woman who loved a stubborn rancher enough to save him from himself. It was a story worth remembering, a love worth celebrating, a legacy worth preserving. And in the end, that was all anyone could hope for. To love and be loved, to build something lasting, to leave the world a little better than they found it. Logan and Elena Quincy had done exactly that, and their love story lived on in the land they'd worked, the family they'd raised, and the partnership they'd forged that became the foundation for everything that came after.